Picking up immediately from the previous installation, as the armored thrust having had occurred from one of the 5 cordoning battalions around the Irving Pocket, which was one of the 3 armored battalions, as the other 2 cordoning battalions were the same 2 mechanized infantry battalions that had effectively cleared and annihilated all defending forces within the city of Grand Prairie, which even included its horribly battle-scarred Taylor Army heliport. These same 2 mechanized infantry battalions from the 16th Infantry Division were operating together with the 3 armored battalions from the 35th Armored Brigade, who had, along with the 2 air assault battalions from the active duty 83rd Air Assault Brigade, had seized the DFW International Airport, as the 3 armored battalions each took a position on the outer cordon around the last remaining viable American military defending forces, which was the remnants of the 3rd of the 144th, with half of it effectively being outright annihilated in the 5-hour-long ensuing artillery barrage from midnight until 5 a.m., as the 300mm multiple-launch rocket systems from the Northern Firing Grouping of the 19th Artillery Brigade, along with the 2 howitzer battalions, one towed PLL-01 battalion, one of 2 in the brigade, and also one of 2 PLL-66 battalions, 152mm towed howitzers. Of course, there were 2 in the brigade of these types of battalions, but one of each howitzer type in the Northern Firing Grouping, comprising a total of 112 howitzers, all arrayed in such a way that their azimuths of fire and fields of fire covered much of the northern portion of the city, while the southern grouping and their azimuths of fire for their Type 83 MLRS systems, as they had 2 battalions of these, which were 122mm systems, which were effectively a part of the PHL-81 family of Chinese MLRS systems, as there were 2 battalions of these in the southern grouping, and also the other battalion each of the 152mm towed PLL-66 howitzers, and the other battalion of the PLL-01 155mm towed howitzers, also in the southern grouping. In the northern grouping, not only would these artillery forces play a massive role in the last push into the city of Irving, which contained the last remaining large cluster of defenders, at least within city limits of the Metroplex as a whole, but also other artillery assets would also support the thrust into the pocket as well, which included the self-propelled howitzers, as the PLZ-05 155mm self-propelled howitzers equipped the 2 different firing battalions, one belonging to the 35th Armored Brigade and the other belonging to the 16th Infantry Division, as these systems, which were 155mm as well, would conduct massive support for the ground forces as they pushed in and begun to clear the pocket, as this was a massive cordon and sweep / kill box operation as a whole. The PCL 181 battalion of also self-propelled but highly mobile truck-based howitzers, which formed the firing battalion of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, would, after seeing heavy service in the Fort Worth area, be utilized heavily the following day, as air assault forces would effectively storm the national grasslands right outside of the city limits and would clear the area of thousands of hiding armed civilians trying to take refuge and effectively coordinate and organize themselves into some kind of effective fighting force. However, this would never materialize, as again, the PLA air assault forces would be utilized heavily in this operation. Even sniper spotter teams from the 59th Special Operations Battalion would also assist, as the massive PLAAF aircraft support and also even their own built-in attack helo gunship support would effectively win the day, along with also having their own fire support assets in the form of a 82 millimeter mortar company as their ground-based fire support assets in each and every air assault battalion, as this is a mortar blast in this particular area. These forces would effectively wipe the entire metroplex clean. However, one of the two battalions, having had assaulted the DFW International Airport from the 83rd Air Assault Brigade from the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, would effectively be able to support the Irving operation with medevac operations, as the other battalion was currently conducting a maintenance operation on their Z-20 utility helicopters of their transport aviation company, and the other air assault battalion having had captured the DFW International Airport. However, one transport aviation company from the other battalion would be available for medevac operations and even bringing in supplies if need be for logistical resupply operations. However, they would mostly be utilized for their medevac capabilities as the most critically wounded among the PLA troops, as PLA would suffer some terribly wounded in this operation, would be airlifted out via Z-20 utility helo flights, as well as also the vehicle losses that would occur in the fighting in the South would effectively be the heaviest PLA losses in the fight for the city of Irving, as all of the thrusts not only strategically served a purpose of mopping up heavily enemy-held areas and also destroying the 3rd of the 144th, which was mostly in the center of the pocket as its last viable surviving combat units that were in the parking garages and the multi-floor steel-reinforced concrete parking garages had survived completely with their troops and equipment. They had emerged and effectively knew not where each other was because they had lost their ISR and communications capabilities due to PLA electronic warfare assets, which were ground-based from the 59th Electronic Warfare Regiment, as well as aviation-based from the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, which were now returning to the battle space, as well as also the JH-7 Flying Leopards. Both aircraft types, the JH-7 strike aircraft and the H-6Ks, carried the state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods, which could target the source of various radio and radar signals and jam them with electromagnetic jamming effectively. And these aircraft effectively prevented any redundant communications capabilities of the Americans from working in this operation, as were the ground-based systems as well. As now, in this particular battle map, as we go to the map of the southern sector of the operation in the general southeast of the pocket, as in the east of the pocket, the thrust conducted by the Dismounted Armored Infantry Company, along with the one tank company from the Armored Battalion holding the eastern segment of the cordon. In the south, one of two mechanized infantry battalions would effectively utilize all of their companies in the effort of containing the forces from retreating of armed reactionary civilians, as well as encountering and destroying Bravo Company that was now moving southwards from its original bivouac site from the 3rd of the 144th, and also cutting off a grouping of 200 armed reactionary civilians from the main body as one company would strike deep into the pocket. It was the KLX plant along the Trinity River, right in this area, would be within striking distance of all the forces now moving into the pocket. The ultimate ending of the operation would see 200 armed reactionary civilians being cut off by the drive south in the northeast of the pocket, while another 200 in the far west of the pocket would be cut off by the same drive south and the same drive north, while the drive coming from the west would mop up large numbers of concentrated armed reactionary civilians of the entirety of the 1,800 survivors in this area, the original number of armed reactionary civilians having been approximately 5,000, but they were mostly all wiped out in the gargantuan artillery barrage, with the rest taking cover, with tens of thousands of non-combatant deaths as a result of the massed artillery barrage, as all of the heavy artillery firepower caught many non-combatants off guard and ill-prepared, and many of them suffered the ultimate reward, if it could be said, for their lack of preparedness, which was their total destruction, as this was effectively not a positive result, this was effectively what happened in most wars. In most wars, the heaviest casualties come from the non-combatants, while the prepared armed reactionary civilians, having had taken cover underground wherever and however they could, they were now emerging, including 500 in this particular area where this mechanized infantry battalion, one of two, was holding the south of the cordon, as they, in this area, would have one company spread out, vehicles and dismounted troops to hold a just over 1 mile segment of the cordon, while another company struck up a main thoroughfare heading north, and 3 other mechanized infantry companies surrounded this grouping of 200 armed reactionary civilians cut off from their main body, and another company would move to the west to effectively cut off the escape of the Bravo Company of the 3rd of the 144th. Again, it has to be understood, armed reactionary civilians were frantically spreading messages throughout the pocket, informing everyone from each side of the pocket that they had been surrounded by PLA forces. Again, a few of the armed reactionary civilians would make attempts to escape to other parts of the city by taking sewer systems and drainage systems out of the area and underneath the PLA cordon, and some would succeed. Others would not, as they would be discovered by quadcopter and high-altitude recon assets running their circuits throughout this area, as the PLA had a complete and total iron grip on the area in terms of surveillance, as their ISR capabilities were simply gargantuan, and they had the entire DFW Metroplex on lockdown in terms of mapping it all in real time from the quadcopter level to the high-altitude level to the satellite level. And very few would make it out with their lives, although some would, especially those that stayed underground for the longest amount of time of their trip out of the Irving area. As the flanks were safe for the 5 participating battalions in the cordon, as again the surveillance apparatus could see everything, as most American forces in the city had been outright and totally annihilated, leaving really only a core of defending forces left in the Irving area that were now totally surrounded. The rest of the areas were effectively all occupied by PLA forces that had moved into the east of the Metroplex, that had moved up through the center of the Metroplex, and that had taken effectively control of the west. All that was effectively left were the hordes, massive groupings of armed reactionary civilians having had fled into the national grasslands, where they would effectively be hunted down by PLA air assault forces committed to battle with massive PLA-AF support, artillery support from other PLA units, of course their own built-in support from their 82mm mortar companies in each air assault battalion, as well as also their built-in attack helo gunship support from their combat aviation companies in each air assault battalion, just as there was a mortar company, 4 air assault infantry companies, a transport aviation company, and of course, their headquarters and support company, as these forces were a quasi-elite, very well-armed fighting force. They were the obvious choice to deploy against the holdouts the following day that were hiding in the national grasslands, as all of this firepower was simply immense, and the capabilities of these forces to get to where they needed to go with a exceedingly high degree of rapidity and efficiency would place them right in the midst of the defending forces, and do so with great speed and surprise. This, along with all their heavy fire support that they would receive, would simply smash enemies to pieces and bloody bits, in the very literal sense as well, as many of the defending forces would not see it coming, as the battle would effectively rage and then die down, as it would go from a set-piece battle to a search and destroy mission for any survivors of the initial raids into the national grasslands. As it pertained to the operation unfolding within the Metroplex itself, within the actual urban areas, the Z-20 utility helos would be utilized for medevac purposes and again be available for possible logistical transport operations, although again, they would mostly be utilized for their medevac purposes as they were already being utilized in the fighting going on in the east of the pocket as the armored forces struck west as they would have some critically wounded, and the Z-20s from one of the two victorious air assault battalions that had seized the DFW International Airport would fly the medevac operations and take them to the makeshift hospitals set up by the 59th Support Brigade and then return and prepare to either drop off supplies or conduct more medevac operations. In the south, as the mechanized infantry, as we go to the map, we're now moving into this area with great force. There was a major thoroughfare that had a concrete and dirt-filled median that ran through this area. This was a former large residential area, although there were some commercial areas that were along this main thoroughfare. There was walls that were now badly gutted that separated these former businesses from the residential neighborhoods, as these were residential blocks, a city park, and more businesses and more homes, and a former gas station smashed to ruins and more business buildings in this area here, more residential areas behind it. Effectively, what was happening was as the PLA mechanized infantry thrust deep and fast into this area, what occurred was as their forces effectively were preparing to engage and destroy the Bravo Company, which they saw Bravo Company long before Bravo Company saw them and moved against it accordingly. The armed reactionary civilians in the area came rushing out of any and all hiding places amid the rubble and beneath it, including from sewer systems, as these PLA mechanized infantry troops rolled into the area, and by 9 a.m. the fighting had begun in earnest in the south, just as it was in the north, as the Northern Cordon Armored Battalion had sent forces to conduct a sweeping operation in a 2-mile wide by 1 mile south area to begin with, as they would ultimately cut off armed reactionary civilians in the northeast of the pocket and a small grouping of 200 in the west, as 200 would be trapped in the north and the west, as these forces would ultimately meet, while the forces striking in from the east, moving west, would sweep a large number of armed reactionary civilians and neutralize them, as they also entered a heavily rubbled area that was mostly a commercial and residential area that was in fact immediately a mile to the east of this location. The KLX plant was a mile to the northeast of this location, and this major thrust up this boulevard by this company, as all 6 mechanized infantry companies of the battalion were involved in this effort, including the cutting off and destruction of 200 armed reactionary civilians in a smaller pocket, as this was one company pictured, this being another company here that was to engage and destroy and cut off Bravo Company as they tried to break out of the pocket because they knew they were now surrounded, and the company captain took initiative to try to break out. His orders were to fight their way out of encirclement, but it would never happen. So this company of the battalion was effectively striking north up the main thoroughfare to cut off the main body of 500 armed reactionary civilians from the 200 in this area and the entirety of Bravo Company, which had been intact as they had emerged from their bivouac sites and moved south as they came out of their parking garage. This company was a 130-man strong company of mechanized infantry forces, and they would be heavily hit by a pair of JH-7 strike aircraft, dropping thousands of pounds upon them, as well as also the firepower coming from the mechanized infantry forces and artillery against their vehicles, as their strongest and most capable vehicles were, of course, their Bradley IFVs with their 25mm autocannon and their 2-tow missile pods. the destruction of these vehicles was absolutely imperative by all of the forces involved, as the dismounted mechanized infantry forces had HJO-8 ATGMs, they had Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades with either the anti-armor or anti-personnel round, which is effectively a fragmentation round, and these weapons were also very devastating and available in massive quantities, as again they had their HJO-8s. They also had their heavy machine guns in the form of their 12.7 millimeter W85 heavy machine guns that effectively equipped their Type 89 armored personnel carriers. They also had their ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicles, which were bristling with weapons and capabilities and were well armored and could take enormous abuse from enemy fire. But they had laser and IR scrambling capabilities, as these were very advanced combat vehicles, and effectively this protected them from all manner of anti-tank weaponry, except for, of course, unguided weapons, such as light anti-armor weapons in the form of the AT-4s that were now the main available anti-armor weaponry that the American National Guard forces effectively had, besides the tow missiles that were aboard their infantry fighting vehicles, as well as the very scant few javelins that they had left, as again the National Guard got the lowest priority for anti-tank guided missiles, as of course their vehicles would contain them, but they, as far as their dismounted troops, had very few javelins or man-portable tow systems available for their own use, as the active duty units got the highest priority for ATGMs, and this company effectively only had 3 javelin systems, and the use of these systems effectively would be very minimal, as they would not be able to get off very many shots by the time the full might of the PLA and PLAAF firepower came crashing down upon them, whether it was the HE warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions on their AI target-seeking mode, influenced by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, an absolute massive surveillance apparatus that mapped everything in real time, from removing enemies that were KIA'd or vehicles that were destroyed to adding vehicles and enemies as soon as they were found in real time, guiding these forces, as each squad NCO and above had one of these combat data links. There was a portable tablet that also could control their quadcopter assets, which all worked together, connected to the AI to map the area in real time with the high altitude surveillance apparatus and the satellites above that. As the 2 mechanized infantry battalions involved each had their own fire support company, with 2 firing platoons of the Type 63 130 millimeter short range light artillery MLRS systems, and 1 firing platoon of the heavy 120 millimeter dual purpose assault gun / mortar system. It could be direct fired into enemy strong points or groups or vehicles, or could be canted and fired as a heavy mortar. These systems complemented each other well, as one system was superb at spreading a large amount of munitions over a wide area to saturate groupings of dismounts, soft-skin vehicles, or light targets, while the heavy assault gun / mortar could be brought forward and fired into stronger positions or against stronger vehicles and equipment, or fired as a mortar on top of enemy forces and absolutely annihilate the things that the 130 millimeter rockets couldn't. Although this had a slightly longer range at 5.5 miles, whereas these had a 5-mile range, both effectively complemented one another and worked well together as fire support for the mechanized infantry troops on the ground. These Type 63s were still highly effective and efficient weapons, as they were rapid to reload, quick to fire, easy to transport and set up. With the use of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system putting together the strike packages, these became ever more efficient than was ever before imaginable, and struck convoys of armed reactionary civilian technicals and other vehicles, as well as groupings of enemy infantry forces on the ground, whether American military or paramilitary forces, such as their alphabet elements, or groupings of armed civilians on foot as infantry-type elements, as in this freeze frame image or illustration or animation of the combat. This grouping of armed reactionary civilian vehicles coming down this road racing off of it as the strikes began to come in, as these are in various stages of blasting these 130 millimeter rockets and throwing scrap and shrapnel and debris and twisted metal and their concussive blast wave tossing vehicles to and fro, or what's left of them. These rockets were immensely destructive and guided in through the ISR capabilities, including the quadcopter assets, running circuits over large areas and mapping areas in real time, discovering enemy forces, and sending strike packages down as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system organized all the strikes. And thus, the destruction was streamlined and highly efficient, highly effective, and always conducted in a very rapid, well-coordinated manner. This was something that no other military could do, save for maybe the Russians, but the U.S. military was behind in terms of these capabilities, as China was the world leader in AI and Russia not far behind them. For all the American boasting in terms of these capabilities, they were not anywhere near what China had in terms of integration of AI into the military domain, as now, with all the combat data streamlined and the ability to effectively put together strike packages for multiple different systems near simultaneously, it made the PLA the by far deadliest force that ever existed in all human history, anywhere in the world at any time, as all of this firepower from the fire support company that was part of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, as the two battalions each had their own fire support company with their headquarters platoon, one platoon of PLL-05s, two platoons of the Type 63s. These systems would fire in a highly coordinated manner with the precision artillery strikes put together by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, sending down these pre-prepared strike packages for the 16th Infantry Division's PLZ-05 battalion to fire their potent 155mm shells, as well as also, if needed, the PLZ-05 battalion of the 16th, as well as the PLZ-05 battalion of the 35th Armored Brigade, could also support the troops anywhere in the pocket at any time with high degrees of precision, as these precision strike packages were put together by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system using the ISR apparatus grafted into it as its eyes and ears at all times. As the PCL 181 battalion, which was a highly mobile 155mm battalion in addition to the track-based 155mm PLZ-05s, the PCL 181 truck-based systems formed the artillery battalion within the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, or Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade. These were highly mobile systems, and as they were utilized extensively within the opening salvos of the invasion, they would be utilized even more extensively on day 2 of the Battle of DFW, as they would pound armed reactionary civilian positions relentlessly within the national grasslands from their positions on their CCP regime property, firing points which were heavily fortified, as most were fortified with HESCO-like barriers with concertina wire, or simple berms which had troops in machine gun positions to watch different sectors of their perimeter, as they also had fencing beyond these berms. As many people, when observing these properties before the invasion had broken out, had no idea what these berms were for, they effectively would realize it the day the invasion had kicked off. These were massive security measures on these properties to protect these systems from direct fire from any types of enemy forces. As now, the heavy firepower would effectively be coming in a well-coordinated manner, effectively not only assisting in the cordon and sweep operation of the general pocket that was now being swept by these different forces coming in from 3 directions. There were also kill boxes within the pocket being established, such as a massive kill box that would destroy the majority of the 500 armed reactionary civilians in this particular sector of the pocket, as a time-on-target attack with the 300 millimeter PHLO3 systems of one firing battery within the PHLO3 battalion would all fire at that same target at the same time, with all of their rockets pounding this general area from these multiple different systems, as one whole firing battery would pound this area at the same time. And in addition to strikes into this area with thousands of pounds of air-to-ground munitions, 8,000 dropped by one JH-7 on this area, and another 10,000 dropped on this area by the other JH-7 of one pair, as another pair of JH-7s, as these carried nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground munitions and were absolutely devastating strike aircraft, as there were many strike aircraft that couldn't carry nearly the payload that these carried. These strike aircraft would also pound the Bravo Company into dust, as not only would the Bravo Company be struck with 155 and 152 millimeter artillery shells, they would also be struck by direct fire from PLA, mechanized infantry dismounts, including with their man-portable HJ-08 ATGMs, as well as even their light anti-armor weapons, such as their Type 69 -Is or -1s, or just Type 69s for short, which could fire an anti-armor or fragmentation round, which is anti-personnel. These troops would lay down massive fire and enormous destruction upon the Bravo Company, as well as also being supported by their very powerful fire support assets within their battalion, as one of the two mechanized infantry battalions was striking up the center of the south of the pocket. One company would strike up this main boulevard, as the KLX plant was only a mile to the northeast of this map. This map was a 1.5 mile area by 1 mile area north to south and 1.5 east to west. One company out of three that would surround the 200 in this pocket from the same battalion would cut off these 200 from these 500 as this company struck up the middle, and the last company that spread out with its vehicles and troops spread out to cover a large area, a nearly 1.5 mile area, would watch the south and prevent escape through there from the same battalion, as they were just off this map doing that particular part of the cordon. So it was one company, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 that surrounded this. The other battalion was off map and conducting their segment of the cordon in their part facing the southwest, as the other battalion, as it had its fire support company sitting a mile back, just as this assaulting battalion did as well, with their headquarters and support companies, which were the command and logistical assets of the entire battalion in each battalion. The headquarters and support companies also had their own combat drone section in each headquarters and support company, with their TEL-like 48-tubed loitering munition systems to fire the CH-901As. And 48 would be fired at a time with HE warheads from each of these two battalions, just as the armored battalions holding the northeast and west were doing the same with their loitering munitions capabilities, as the fire support assets of the other battalion that was holding the southwestern portion of the cordon would also assist in strikes in this operation with the fire support company of the participating battalion's forces. Two different battalions' fire support assets would be supporting this one battalion who was striking into this area, as well as also the 19th Artillery Brigade's PHLO3 battalion, with one firing battery focusing immense firepower on this one area alone, as all ISR directed, with shell fire would be immense in this area as well. Not only from the rocket-assisted projectiles, the standard rocket-assisted projectiles from the PLL-01 battalion in the Northern Firing Grouping and the standard rocket-assisted projectiles of the 152 millimeter PLL-66s, but again, the PHLO3 300 millimeter rockets, as well as also the 155 millimeter standard HE rounds and DPICM rounds coming in from the 16th Infantry Division's self-propelled 155 millimeter PLZ-03 battalion. And again, the same type of battalion in the 35th Armor Brigade in the north with the same systems could also support the operation anywhere at any time in the pocket as well, as all of these forces had been effectively heavily resupplied, and the maintenance activities conducted with all of their gear and equipment, these forces were all immensely destructive. And as the heavy strategic bomber aircraft, now returning to the battle space by 9 a.m., could also support the operation in a tactical way, as they mostly already had, especially in terms of the H-6Ks, as the H-6Ks effectively destroyed two entire American battalions nearly single-handedly. As they were striking strategic targets that were defended by American units, they conducted a strategic and tactical carpet munitioning raid, as two H-6Ks working together smashed the massive Raytheon and surrounding industrial areas in the Richardson area, while also destroying the 2nd of the 142nd in this massive air raid, as the vast majority of this force was laid waste to, just as the single H-6K had carpet munition most of the 1st of the 204th into oblivion, conducting effectively a SEAD operation with the artillery strikes, as well as missile strikes from tactical, ballistic, and also cruise missiles into this area to strike the factory, as well as a naval air station, with the H-6K also using the rest of its munitions on the 1st of the 204th's headquarters of Headquarters Company and their attached support company, who were in the Meacham International Airport, as they assisted in the strikes there after they carpet munitioned the Lockheed Martin plant on Lockheed Martin Boulevard, along with the 1st of the 204th SHORAD Battalion, effectively into the dust, as these heavy strategic bombers effectively not only destroyed their strategic targets and even tactical targets, but they laid waste to massive areas of the city below, as these were even more destructive than the gargantuan artillery forces that were effectively hellacious on their own. Even if there wasn't PLAAF heavy strategic bombing, even what these forces had conducted with their massed fires was simply unquantifiable, as large swathes of the entire metroplex lay in complete and total rubbled ruination from these artillery strikes alone. Even in the southern grouping, which contained the other PLL-01 Towed Howitzer Battalion, the other PLL-066 Towed Howitzer Battalion, and also the two Type 83 122mm MLRS battalions, these forces in the southern grouping of the artillery of the 19th Artillery Brigade were arranged in such a way to where their azimuths of fire covered the southern portion of the city, while the northern grouping covered the north, which included not only Irving, but also the DFW airport region and the city of Dallas. Even southeast Dallas was hit by the PHL-03 systems from their position, as they had an 80-mile total range and could hit targets even a bit beyond this entire battle space, as this was a 60-mile east-west by 30-mile north-south battle space in total. And as the forces now struck into this area from one of the two cordoning mechanized infantry battalions, this effectively was a five-company operation of their 6 total mechanized infantry companies, as one was spread out to guard the southern end of the pocket. The other 5 were participating actively in surrounding this grouping of 200 armed reactionary civilians, cutting off the others, and also Bravo Company's escape. And that was what was going on here, as part of the smaller pocket of 200 is being surrounded by this one company here, with another company off map in the south and another one holding the west. While in this area, one company had moved up the boulevard and taken positions to block the escape of the Bravo Company, having had emerged from their bivouac sites, dismounting many of their troops, effectively all but 1 platoon's worth, as the first 2 platoons had fully dismounted all their squads to prepare to fight the oncoming Bravo Company, who had no idea that there were PLA troops ahead of them until they got within visual range and could effectively see through their optics of their vehicles, as the Americans would do their best to get off some shots, especially from the lead Bradley IFVs with their powerful 25mm autocannons and their 2 tow missile pods, one PLA armor personnel carrier would actually be destroyed by a tow missile that one Bradley would manage to get off before it was completely destroyed by the raw might of PLA artillery, ATGMs from the dismounted troops, and from the infantry fighting vehicles having HJ-09 pods on the sides of their turrets, as well as also the light anti-armor weapons like the rocket-propelled grenades and more, as the fire support elements would be supporting the mechanized infantry troops, as would the precision artillery strikes coming from the 16th Infantry Division's own artillery, and again, if needed, the 35th Armor Brigades, although their artillery battalion was mostly supporting the efforts that were unfolding in the north by their own forces, and also that were now ongoing moving west from their eastern cordon, as again, it would take 3 hours to clear a 1.5 mile area by 1 mile area into the west from the east of the cordon, as they were clearing 650 armed reactionary civilians and the remains of what was called the Lost Platoon of Delta Company, which was a platoon of mechanized infantry troops that never made it to the KLX plant, as all of the survivors from half of the battalion, as half the battalion had been destroyed in the artillery strikes, losing all their vehicles and most of their troops. The surviving troops from HHC Company, from Delta Company, which is one of the 4 mechanized infantry companies, and also the Foxtrot Company, coming from the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, were now holed up in the KLX plant, which, interestingly enough, was one of the sites that this whole battalion was actually tasked with defending, as many of the critical military industrial sites were to be defended. As the Americans were stretched thin, they couldn't defend all their critical sites, which included power plant and water and sewage treatment infrastructure, so they had to pick and choose, and they decided to defend military industrial targets, which effectively made them easier to destroy, as the PLA forces could get effectively 2-for-1s, as the saying went, because they could conduct strategic air raids or massed artillery barrages, which laid waste to American forces defending these sites, or conduct massive ground strike operations, tactical air strikes, tactical air raids with the actual strike aircraft themselves, like the JH-7 Flying Leopards. And as all of these forces were now arrayed for battle, the Bravo Company, trying to break out of encirclement, as they had discovered that they were encircled by the news traveling relatively quickly throughout the 5.5 east-west by 4 mile north-south pocket, as armed reactionary civilians moving to and fro spread news quickly as they told one another about the PLA troops on all sides, which eventually made its way to the American troops in terms of information, and thus they had to make decisions, as they lacked ISR and communications capabilities due to the tandem anti-SAT, cyber strikes, and electronic warfare capabilities that were jamming redundant communications and ISR capabilities, and thus the units were effectively relatively close together in terms of their physicality, as they effectively had to stay within eyeshot or earshot, or line of sight or earshot communications in order to communicate or use runners. And as a result, vehicles bunched up into concentrated groups that made them easier to destroy by the concentration of massed PLA firepower from the PLAAF and the PLA ground forces, or the Army, as it is. As these firepower torrents of munitions of absolute destruction coming from artillery, coming from the strategic aircraft, coming from the tactical fighter bombers or ground attack or strike aircraft, if you will, and coming from even fire support assets, PLA armor, and, of course, infantry fighting vehicles, and even the lowly, humble infantryman with all of his available firepower would all work together coordinated through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which guided all these forces on all of their movement and economize and maximize their firepower to the fullest extent of their capabilities, making them exceedingly more lethal than any other army that ever existed throughout all of human history. The PLA was now the most destructive fighting force the world had ever known because of their integration, of their total firepower dominance, as nobody could challenge the production capacity of China, including their military production and their firepower advantages, as well as also their immense stockpiles of munitions, the largest the world had ever seen and known, as well as also their ability to integrate brand new technologies like artificial intelligence, brand new IT technologies, and also ISR capabilities, which China had gargantuan ISR capabilities as the world's largest drone-producing nation by a massive gulf, as well as even their ISR aircraft that they possessed, all integrated with the AI to see everything everywhere in real time. It was almost godlike in a way in terms of being omnipresent with many of their capabilities in the realm of AI and ISR being blended together. And that's godlike with a little g. That's the man or humankind trying to utilize capabilities to propel them to a state of being that was never before possible in terms of warfare and capabilities. The PLA was now the most capable military on the planet due to this gargantuan technological advantage over basically everyone else, with only Russia right behind them in these capabilities. As the PLA in this particular sector of the cordon was now having dismounted their troops of the company now facing the north, as they held the south of this cordon, preparing for the arrival of Bravo Company, close air support airstrikes were called in from a pair of JH-7s as these vehicles were now moving into place and opening fire back and forth, as they also had already dismounted their squads to move ahead of them and around them to conduct reconnaissance, as again, there was no ISR capabilities among the American forces, as this platoon's squads, all four of which, in single column formations, were now crossing the street to get into rubbled positions. The quadcopter assets from this company's lead platoon, 5 of which were running circuits in this direction. The next platoon was running circuits over this area, acquiring targets for the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And the southern platoon was running circuits with their quadcopters over this area, mapping everything in real time, while these 3 combat platoons of this company holding this end of the cordon around the smaller grouping of 200 armed reactionary civilians, as there were 500 across the main boulevard, which had, as this main thoroughfare had concrete and dirt-filled medians or abutments that ran down the middle of this major thoroughfare. This was a massive former residential area with some commercial sites along the main thoroughfare. There were walls that separated the backyards of these homes from these businesses. This is all businesses, homes, a city park, swing sets, playground equipment, seesaw, basketball courts, walking trail. All of this destroyed in the 5-hour-long massed artillery barrage, and it was about to get hit again as the PLA artillery forces of the Northern Firing grouping of battalions, again, a total of 112 howitzers between the 2 howitzer battalions, and 40 300mm PHL-03 MLRS systems, in addition to the 112 total howitzers, the towed PLL-66s and PLL-01 towed howitzers, as all of this firepower was augmented by the additional 155mm firepower from the PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzer battalion of the 16th Infantry Division and the fire support assets of 120mm heavy mortars from the PLL-05, firing platoon and the fire support company of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion partaking in this assault, as well as the 2 firing platoons of the multiple launch Type 63 130mm light artillery MLRS systems working together to support the troops in the field, along with the headquarters and support company over the entire battalion. The command and logistical forces, which even contained a combat drone section, fired the loitering munitions, 48 at a time, 48 to support their troops in this operation that would crash down with HE warheads upon the defending forces, as they opted for the HE warheads, as they could have picked fragmentation, but they knew they would be going up against American lighter armored vehicles like M113s, also their headquarters platoon vehicles, which were actually behind this grouping but would be destroyed in the airstrikes and artillery strikes. As all of this ensued, the vehicles moved ahead as their dismounted wedge formation mechanized infantry squads bounded and covered tactically toward the PLA forces, laying down heavy fire, including 40mm tube-fired grenades from beneath rifles of some of the troops that possessed those in these squads. As this squad advanced in a single column formation, it would be hit by mortar strikes from 120mm heavy mortars coming in, as again, this is a dual-purpose weapon. It could be used as an assault gun or canted and fired as a heavy mortar. These were mortar strikes on these platoons that were laying down or on these squads of these platoons that were laying down heavy fire on PLA forces. Again, they advanced in different directions. Some squads, these 2, went out of these vehicles. These are armor personnel carriers, M113s, and they begun to move to the west to conduct reconnaissance, while the vehicles moved forward ever so slightly before they were heavily pounded by artillery, as the quadcopter assets of this company's forces were running circuits through this area, getting targeting data in real time to pound these forces into oblivion. As these mortars came in, along with artillery strikes from 155 shells all throughout this area, vehicles would be destroyed, especially with the JH-7 strikes, as this pair of JH-7s was conducting close air support against these vehicle columns of these 3 combat platoons of Bravo Company. Each JH-7 dropping 8,000 pounds of free-fall munitions from special racks to just pound this entire area, which would also include just off-map the headquarters platoon, which was the command and logistical elements of this Bravo Combat Company of Mechanized Infantry, Bravo Company, from the 3rd of the 144th. As artillery strikes would come in and pound the hell out of these 2 squads that had dismounted to conduct recon, they would be absolutely outright annihilated, as with the vehicles, between the airdrop munitions and heavy artillery strikes from 155 and even 152 shells landing in this area, destroying these forces, while mortars would land on these squads that were moving south, as this platoon on the very west had dismounted 2 recon to the west and had dismounted their forward 2 squads from their platoon to conduct their own reconnaissance to the general south and southwest. These would fail miserably, as mortars and artillery strikes would come in, as these forces also traded fire, as the PLA fired their heavy machine gun turrets, the 12.7mm anti-materiel W85 heavy machine guns. These were very powerful weapons, as well as also their IFV-based weaponry, as their IFVs also had laser and IR scrambling capabilities and were bristling with weapons such as 100mm main guns, as well as even a connected 30mm autocannon adjacent to it, which is also massively destructive, as well as the very powerful and well-ranged HJ09 ATGMs, 2 apiece on the side pods, as they had a 3.5-mile range. These had an excellent range advantage in terms of infantry fighting vehicles, although the American Bradley was definitely a force to be reckoned with its 25mm autocannon and its 2-tow missile pods. The Bradleys would only be able to destroy 1 PLA vehicle, and it would be an armor personnel carrier, while another Bradley would badly damage another APC, getting off some 25mm shots at it before their troops bounded into this position, as they ceased fire as they moved up. These troops then bounding and covering laid down heavy fire, while these squads and these double-column rolling shields were firing between their vehicles at these American troops, as mortars were called in through the quadcopter assets running circuits from this company holding this entire sector of the cordon, and artillery strikes and the air strikes that came in simply wrecked what was left of Bravo Company, destroying all their vehicles, including the personnel that were driving and gunning as the drivers and gunners, and also the platoon NCOs, such as the sergeant's first class, as well as the second lieutenants that were in the vehicles still, and also the company captain, and also the still mounted up logistical forces like the maintenance section and everybody else that was medics and more that were in the headquarters platoon with the captain. They were destroyed along with the first sergeant as well. They were all wiped out by these airstrikes and artillery strikes that were relentless, that came in and annihilated Bravo Company. This fighting in this area against Bravo Company would be over far faster than the fighting that was going on now with the armed reactionary civilians that had materialized seemingly out of nowhere as they came up out of their hiding spots after the gargantuan artillery barrage had ceased, and even some emerged with vehicles from some of the parking garages that were in the area as well, as this grouping had 8 vehicles that were being utilized, and this grouping only had 4, with most of the armed reactionary civilians moving on foot. This area would be pounded heavily by tactical airstrikes from the strike aircraft, from the JH-7s, that would conduct effectively close air support and strike operations in this area, as they would effectively assist in the time on target strike, which would blanket this whole area here in rockets as one system of the multiple launch 300 millimeter rockets could blanket an area larger than a grid square, slightly larger. And if multiple systems were firing at the same exact target point, it was a time on target technique effectively where all these different rockets would pound the same area at nearly or at the same time, as these would all hit from the same battery in this general area. As these rockets would cover this area, as this was the targeting point, it would wipe out this entire area, and it would be somewhat danger close for this company here that was striking up the middle and also holding this section of the cordon, if you will, while the other company to the south was spread out and holding their section. While not engaging in direct combat with enemy forces, defenders that were in the pocket, they were holding the area, and any that came into their fields of fire were wiped out, while the main action was going on right here in this area, as the northeast of this smaller pocket is effectively what is occurring right here, as at the same time as this fighting against Bravo is going on, and these troops are bounding and covering, firing AT-4s, firing 40 millimeter tube-fired grenades at these PLA troops who are returning fire with their heavy machine guns on their vehicles as their gunners open fire, also the infantry fighting vehicles opening fire, loitering munition strikes coming in and hitting these personnel, mortar strikes, artillery strikes, everything coming in and pounding these personnel along with direct fire. All of this, all these strikes from loitering munitions, mortars, artillery systems was immense, and it was too much, including with the airstrikes coming in from the pair of JH-7s striking this area. These were effectively the same JH-7s that flew over the initial area where the initial thrust into the pocket began, as the outer cordon forces holding the east sent in 2 companies, again, 1 armored infantry company on foot and 1 tank company that they would support mutually as they thrust into the pocket, 2 JH-7s that flew over an apartment complex of what remained of it in that area, including its swimming pool, were now conducting these strikes against Bravo as it had emerged and been discovered and would ultimately be destroyed in the immensity of the artillery barrage, along with the mortar strikes from the PLL-05 systems, as well as the 30 millimeter strikes occurring against the armed reactionary civilians, as these would be most effective against them, as all of this action was occurring concurrently to the fighting against Bravo. This entire operation, from the movement into place to the effectively sweeping the area post-victory over these forces, would be a 2-hour-long operation, similar to the thrust that had come in down into the south from the northern cordon forces with their 3 companies, 2 tank and 1 armored infantry. They, pushing into this area, would eventually link up with the mechanized infantry near the Trinity River and would then block in the remaining armed reactionary civilians on 2 different sides of this 5.5 by 4 mile pocket north-south, as the majority of the 3rd of the 144th, as in their Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, and their surviving elements that were holed up in the KLX plant, were mostly in the center of this pocket, with, again, some of the survivors of the shattered half of the battalion hiding in the KLX plan, as the battalion was made of 6 companies, as 3 had been mostly wiped out in the artillery barrage. The other 3 were only preserved due to being in the multi-story parking garages with their very robust and very strong steel-reinforced concrete floors. As the top floors were destroyed, the bottom floors protected the vehicles and troops, and even in some cases, these armed reactionary civilians in their vehicles, and they emerged from hiding in some of these places as well. And now they were trying to conduct a very brave but very brazen and foolish assault on the PLA forces that were now racing up this main thoroughfare. And now they would dismount there. As they moved into place, they dismounted their lead platoon facing towards the east to confront armed reactionary civilians hiding in former rubbled buildings in the area, as their lead IFV fired 100mm and 30mm shells against this grouping and destroyed them before dismounting their troops, who bounded and covered. As this group bounded, and they bounded. Same went here, they bounded, and then they bounded a little bit further ahead, but not before the artillery and mortars came in, along with heavy rocket strikes from the 130mm light artillery rockets that completely ripped apart this vehicle column to pieces. All 12 of these armed reactionary civilian vehicles in this neighborhood were completely and totally shredded into little bits of scrap and twisted metal, with the personnel inside being ripped to shreds as well, with limbs and pieces of body parts thrown in multiple directions. These 130mm ISR guided strikes were simply massively destructive, and these strikes even wiped out a grouping of armed reactionary civilians on foot running down this particular block, along with artillery strikes from precision strikes from 155mm howitzers, such as the 16th Infantry Division's PLZ-05 Battalion, with 1 firing battery firing in this quadrant of the battle, hitting these forces in this area first as the vehicles moved down and were being struck by rockets. They were also struck in the front by 155 shells, the front of their convoy, along with 120mm mortars fired from the PLL-05 systems of the Fire Support Company of the battalion. Again, the other fire support company from the other mechanized infantry battalion was also firing in support of the active mechanized infantry battalion carrying out this attack. They were mostly firing at this smaller pocket and against the Bravo Company from their positions just off this map to the west. Again, the other battalion was sealing off their portion of the cordon to the west of this action right here by this other mechanized infantry battalion of the 16th ID. They were firing as they had staggered weapons to watch all directions of approach of their column. They had not dismounted their troops, as this platoon from their combat elements, as this was their headquarters platoon, safely wedged between these two companies, as this was their combat elements of this company, and this was their headquarters platoon. The headquarters platoon of this company was just off the map, and the headquarters platoon of this company was following behind, as again, another company to the south from the same battalion spread out, their troops effectively fanning out between vehicles, which were widely spaced out to cover a large area with fields of fire that effectively faced inward to prevent escape from the large numbers of armed reactionary civilians that were now penned into an absolute kill box by these two companies, one off map to the south and the company striking up through the center. As all of this fighting was going on, this platoon that had dismounted before the airstrikes had occurred had bounded and covered into these rebel positions, but not before they lost 1 squad immediately, as the precision mortar strikes from 120mm mortars came in and wiped out this entire squad from this Bradley before these other 2 had bounded and covered into position and engaged the lead platoon of these PLA forces. Again, they would lose 1 of their vehicles as they would move into position here, as the American forces would fire and destroy this APC, but not before they had dismounted their squads to move against these armed reactionary civilians in this area that were trying to desperately break out of this area. As the fighting initiated at the very beginning in the south, fighting was heavy as armed reactionary civilians materialized out of their hiding spaces, mostly underground and in sewers and drainage, but also from some of the more sturdy buildings that were destroyed from the earlier artillery barrages. Heavy machine gun fire had been laid down on dozens of armed reactionary civilians that had emerged in these former shops in the rubble of these former buildings to engage these forces, and a large number of Molotovs would be heaved at this APC and would actually destroy it and actually burn the crew alive and wipe them out from 3rd platoon here. The 2nd platoon, moving up the center, would wipe these forces out with heavy loitering munition strikes with HE loitering munitions, including right here as well. That would assist these heavy machine gunners in wiping out these rubbled positions of these forces that were engaging them at the very opening of the fighting, as heavy machine gun fire, even loitering munition, and also IFV fire into these areas, 100 millimeter shells, and also 30 millimeter autocannon fire would wipe these personnel out, along with loitering munition strikes with HE rounds, causing the rest to retreat deeper into these rubble piles of these former buildings here, which would cause artillery strikes to come down heavy from 155 and 152 millimeter artillery pieces. As these forces moved into place, the barrage was about to occur with the 300 millimeter strikes. As more and more civilians were moving into this area, the airstrikes would occur to strike large numbers of these armed reactionary civilians. One JH-7 dropped 8,000 pounds into this area on this lead group, while the other one continued dropping 10,000 pounds into this area with a wide spread, with artillery strikes coming in, with the fire occurring from the armor personnel carriers, and even the ZBDO-4As firing at these forces with direct fire. As loitering munitions also came in to strike these forces, the spread of munitions and the incoming strike from the 300 millimeter fires coming from one whole firing battery of the PHL-03 battalion would slam the area heavily with munitions. And although available, the heavy strategic bomber aircraft would be used elsewhere, as they were, again, still near fully combat loaded. Even one of 2 H-20s had only used 1/3 of its entire payload on the G&E plant, or what was left of the G&E plant, as most of it had already been destroyed by cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes and even artillery. The remaining buildings on campus, and even the rubble of the remains of the other buildings that had already been struck, were completely flattened and pulverized by the thousands of pounds dropped by the H-20, dropping 30,000 pounds on the G&E plant's remains. And there were more munitions where that came from, because again, there were 3 H-6Ks still fully combat loaded at this point, as they were just returned by 9. And again, there was 1 H-20 that was fully combat loaded, and the other with 2/3 of its remaining munitions still aboard, as these heavy strikes could continue. As the JH-7s, having already returned hours prior, were now joining in the fight, they dropped many thousands of pounds of ordnance as well in this battle, and would smash not just the Bravo Company in this battle with the mechanized infantry facing off against the American mechanized infantry. They would also smash armed reactionary civilians en masse by the hundreds, as this grouping in this area alone, moving through this area, was 200 strong, including in these vehicles. And those moving in this area was effectively 80 strong, moving in these different directions, and they were being attacked by the elements of this company. Again, one armored personnel carrier would be lost to AT-4 fire and Javelin fire, and one would be lost to Molotovs from this company. Again, one had been lost here from a quick fire of a TOW missile destroying this APC. So effectively, these PLA companies would, between this company facing Bravo from the south, holding the cordon, this company striking up the center, would be the only 2 companies that would lose vehicles. But there would be losses among their troops that would require medevac operations, as there was an area that had been effectively cleared between these 3 companies. This clearing would be where the helos could land as this headquarters platoon of this company conducting part of the cordon with two other companies of the smaller grouping of armed civilians that they were now dismounting their one platoon to clear this part of the pocket here. They now had a casualty collection point, and they would suffer casualties from this company here, and even, of course, this company that had faced Bravo, and this company that was striking north of the three companies in this particular battle map. They would suffer casualties. All of the troops in this APC of this one squad, of this platoon, would all be burned alive, as they would not be able to escape the armored personnel carrier in time, as multiple Molotovs from all of these personnel in this rubble positions were heaved at this vehicle, as they resolved to at least destroy one PLA vehicle in the operation. As fighting in this rubble and in these conditions, although the PLA had absolute ISR dominance, there were occasions where, before being destroyed, armed reactionary civilians could get in a few quick licks, but this didn't always work. But in this instance, it had, as these personnel were wiped out by the heavy return fire from the heavy machine guns and ZBDO-4A fire, 30mm autocannon armor-piercing HE rounds, as well as also 100mm fire from the lead ZBDO-4A IFV of this platoon and the heavy 12.7mm concentrated fire into these rubble piles and HE loitering munition strikes, and then causing them all to retreat and be destroyed by artillery fire. They managed to take out one of the armored personnel carriers, as this platoon would lose one APC, and the lead platoon would lose one APC, but all of their troops would survive except the driver and gunner of this APC, as the rest of the squad had dismounted to engage these forces, bounding and covering after the artillery and mortars had struck these lead vehicles of this column, flying into the area with rockets hitting the rest, as 130mm rockets flew into the battle space, guided by the ISR assets that were paired with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, acting as its eyes and ears, all of it being ISR directed, streamlined, and coordinated through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. All of this heavy rocket fire saturating the armed reactionary civilian forces simply pounded them into dust, along with the accompanying artillery fire and exceedingly powerful airstrikes from JH-7s, and, of course, the 300mm rocket fire, as one of the firing batteries from the PHL-03 battalion would fire a time-on-target strike into this area after these JH-7s had already dropped massive payloads of their air-to-ground free-fall munitions and dive attacks, as, of course, they could carry precision munitions, but in this instance, with these many forces on the ground, dive attacks were preferred, with large spreads of 1,000-pounders, which were massively destructive on their own per 1,000-pounder. As the loitering munitions and more artillery strikes occurred here in the park, as this grouping of 25 was trying to move through the park, they were out in the open, spotted and smashed, along with these forces retreating after heavy fighting against this third platoon of combat mechanized infantry troops, as this was three combat platoons followed by their headquarters platoon of this mechanized infantry company of this whole battalion. This was another company, and this was another company, and again, there were two other companies of their six blocking in this grouping of armed reactionary civilians, and their sixth and last mechanized infantry company a block away to the south spread out through this area to block escapes. As this battalion was in the thick of the fighting, the actual combat, again, would effectively last, as the whole battle would be a 2-hour ordeal in this particular battle space. The combat itself would effectively last for just under an hour between all of the fighting to the east of the boulevard and all the fighting that was going on in the smaller pocket and against the attempted escape of the Bravo company. This fighting would be over first, as Bravo would be the priority target and would be wiped out, with the combination of JH-7 strikes, direct fire from this company holding the line of the cordon, as well as also artillery and mortar strikes from the heavy mortar systems and loitering munitions. Again, they would get some proverbial licks in against the PLA forces as they would take position and fire at their vehicles, as all of this indicates they were taking fire as they moved up, and this vehicle would be destroyed by the time it reached this position and dismounted as troops. The gunners would be facing this direction and firing at these forces, although they had staggered weapons. They would turn all their firepower to fight these Army troops as they had their quadcopter assets of this company patrolling this area. These platoons patrolled these different areas and conducted a real-time mapping of this whole area in real time with their quadcopter assets linked in to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, along with the higher altitude assets that patrolled this entire part of the battle space, and the satellite assets all overlaying to provide a real-time mapping of this battlefield. As the fighting in the rubble was exceedingly savage between the PLA troops and the American military forces, and even the armed civilian forces now moving into the area and trying to fight like madmen, as they had no other real option other than to try to break out of this encirclement some kind of way. They were outright annihilated, as they effectively did not have any real leadership. They did not have any real logistical capabilities at this juncture. They did not have any proper coordination. They did not have proper anti-armor weapons, save again for what few Molotovs they had been able to put together by this point in the invasion, which they had used to minor degrees of success, such as having had destroyed, again, one PLA APC. But again, in the grand scheme of things, this was a drop in the bucket. This entire battalion had literally a few hundred plus vehicles, and to destroy only a few meant really nothing in the grand scheme of it all. But it did mean something to the crews of the vehicles, who either were wounded or KIA'd, and their compatriots who were outside of the vehicles conducting operations as well. As this lead platoon, after being dismounted, bounding and covering tactically into place, and to this being dismounted just beyond this abutment, and using the space between their vehicles and abutment to get their bearings before they advanced. These mortar strikes and artillery strikes occurred right before these forces bounded and covered into position, as these vehicles flew into place with rockets impacting at the same time. All of this firepower was highly coordinated, highly precise, highly accurate, and it destroyed these 12 vehicles, and each vehicle having 4 to 5 personnel within it was a large number of KIAs, as all these vehicles were ripped to shreds with everybody within them being destroyed as well. As all of this was enormously destructive, as all this firepower pounded this area here. These forces laid down heavy small arms fire as they bounded and covered into the area and fought from positions in the rubble, as they laid down heavy fire against armed reactionary civilians trying to break their position on the main boulevard and escape. They laid down fire against these forces in this rubble pile up here that had escaped the mortars and artillery strikes and rocket barrages, and they fired at some of these surviving forces at the lead of this grouping before artillery came in and pounded them, including these forces, along with mortar strikes in this area as well, and more artillery. The heavy airstrikes as the munitions spread and pounded this large area, even to the point where it was almost danger close for elements of this middle platoon. These forces pounded this area at the same time that the time on target strikes came in. As these forces were moving and the munitions were dropped, some of them were wiped out behind this large grouping, with the lead elements of this group getting to this position before artillery struck and finished them off, as the massive rocket barrage and the dropped munitions spread and pounded these 80 personnel to pieces with artillery strikes, and these 200 were destroyed in the rocket strikes and this spread of thousands of pounds of munitions, 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions from the JH-7 strikes. Those forces were outright annihilated relatively quickly once all of these different platforms worked together at the same time, coordinated through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR network to eliminate not just Bravo Company, but also massive hordes, groupings of armed reactionary civilian elements in the battlefield. It was exceedingly savage. Mortars struck, HE warhead-equipped loitering munitions struck. Also, besides the mortar strikes, direct fire from heavy machine guns, 100mm shells, 30mm autocannon shells, HJ-09 ATGMs, even 7.62 by 54mm coaxial weapons for personnel that got too close to the vehicle itself. As also, beyond this, all of the fire support assets simply smashed all of these forces to pieces. And, of course, the lowly infantrymen carried a vast array of firepower options, utilized not just against Bravo, but against the armed reactionary civilian elements as well. These armed reactionary civilians stood no chance against the PLA shock troops that would effectively, for the next hour, sweep this area and ensure that there were no survivors. So all this artillery, loitering munition strikes, and air strikes, rocket artillery strikes, even the light artillery rocket strikes, heavy mortar strikes, all of it just completely annihilated everything in this area. And as these troops from this platoon, from this company, holding the smaller cordon, were bounding and covering into the area, this fighting was going on at roughly the same time as this and this fighting over here. They effectively conducted their double column rolling shield, fired at these forces from around their vehicles, called in a mortar strike, and then they begun to come out from around their vehicles, bound and cover tactically through the area. These squads would stay mounted up in their vehicles because they were doing it from an east to west direction. So the other company's platoon down here holding the rest of the cordon would dismount a platoon of their troops with their other two combat platoons and the other whole company blocking the end, conducting a cordon and sweep operation through this area, steadily bounding and covering as these personnel came out of the rubble and tried to move. They would be cut down by the vehicle-based fires as they had a proper angle and traverse on their weapons down these streets, through these alleyways of the former smashed buildings, as well as the troops laying down heavy fire between these personnel and themselves, having intersecting fields of fire, completely wiping these personnel out as they continued to bound and cover tactically through this area. As these troops tried to retreat, they were pursued and fired at as artillery strikes came in with heavy mortar strikes, destroying these personnel in these rubble piles, and these personnel being hit by loitering munitions and heavy firepower from the interlocking fields of fire of the bounding and covering troops and the other two platoons of combat vehicles within this company that was holding this end of the smaller cordon. As these personnel tried to attack these vehicles, they were hit by a mortar and fired at by heavy machine gun fire, as these vehicles had staggered weapons to watch this area of this platoon. They cut these personnel down, and all these personnel were destroyed in heavy shelling, as well as also heavy fire coming in from the bounding and covering troops moving through the area. As the shelling came in before these troops even moved through this area, the fire was going on with danger close artillery strikes coming in as they were bounding and covering. But again, because everything was according to the calculations of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, everything was deemed safe. And again, firepower was economized and maximized as these troops literally swept this pocket from east to west, clearing it of any and all armed reactionary civilians using their quadcopter assets to call in precision mortar, heavy mortar, and artillery strikes on these personnel as they tried to flee from the bounding and covering troops, as they also had interlocking fields of fire during their whole advance from the other vehicles. As they moved and cleared an area, their vehicles still had an L vector of tactical fire that they could lay down into this area, down the streets and through alleys, along with the troops moving through this area as they bounded and covered and cleared this small pocket. Everything was done to a high degree of tactical proficiency. And the casualty collection point that was established with their headquarters platoon would effectively evacuate the wounded via the Z-20 utility helicopters that were coming in from one of the two air assault battalions that was holding the DFW International Airport at this time. as now they would come and pick up the wounded, as there were some severely wounded. Most of the severely wounded came from the fighting. It was very brief between Bravo Company and the Mechanized Infantry Company holding the south end of the cordon facing Bravo as they tried to break out, as well as also from the company that was striking up the center of this boulevard headed north. They were hit by elements of Bravo Company, one of their platoons, bounding and covering into position and firing at their vehicles, destroying one, with their follow-up third platoon losing a vehicle to Molotovs and the troops inside. For the lead platoon, only the driver and gunner were KIA'd, but the troops of these bounding and covering squads, they would have some minor wounded, but the major wounded would come from this company that was facing Bravo as they bounded and covered, and they fired from around their vehicles, and they too lost a vehicle to a tow ATGM, and the forces behind it had some very severely wounded personnel that had to be taken to the casualty collection point and evacuated by the arriving Z-20 utility helos from the Transport Aviation Company, as these medevac flights would come in and pick up the most critically wounded and evacuate them, while the minorly wounded could be treated by the company's medics and their armored ambulances within their headquarters platoons. As this battle, this operation had come to an end, and the sweeps through the area to the immediate east of the main boulevard and the pocket that was already being cleared, the smaller pocket headed west, as well as also the area that Bravo had been destroyed and being swept as these troops would then emerge and sweep this area moving north, would completely clear this 1.5 mile by 1 mile area and put these forces extremely close to the KLX plant, as the armored forces that had pressed down from the north would continue their movement another 2 miles to the south and eventually link up by the Trinity River with the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, having had pushed up through the general center of the pocket. As the forces moving in from the east moving west had mostly cleared large portions of the southeast of the pocket of armed reactionary civilians and even a tiny number of surviving American military forces, they would hold their positions near the KLX plant, as all of these forces would now be within striking distance and able to finish off the tiny remnants of the 3rd of the 144th that even still lived, as the massive destruction that had ensued throughout the course of the fighting, not just in the north and in the east, as the forces struck westward of the armored battalion holding the east of the cordon, but the fighting in the south was extremely intense and saw a massive loss of American lives as the heavy pounding from not just the airstrikes from the strike aircraft, the designated strike aircraft of the PLAAF, the JH-7s, and also the artillery had come in with a vengeance, as the howitzer artillery and the rocket artillery simply annihilated and dominated the battlefield and effectively swept away any and all enemy resistance with it. There will be more to come in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines through a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, as the KLX aircraft plant will be the next major combat operation, as armored infantry troops coming from the attacking companies from the Northern Cordon Battalion would sweep and clear the KLX aircraft plant of the remnants of its remaining forces from the 3rd of the 144th and remnants of armed reactionary civilians who had retreated deeper into this area of the pocket that had not yet been swept by the PLA forces. Effectively, this area would be a massive kill box that would involve heavy carpet munitioning and more tactical airstrikes, as well as also, again, an ample number of artillery strikes into this area. Of course, copious amounts of ATGM strikes would be utilized by the AFT-10 company within the armored battalion whose forces would be striking the KLX plant, with their armored infantry troops effectively clearing out the facility as they would move in and even ford shallow areas of the river with their vehicles and dismount their troops to seize control of the plant. More to come in the next video.